Sarah Martinez had always been the fearless one in her family. Growing up on a small ranch outside Phoenix, she could rope a calf before most kids learned to ride bicycles. Her grandfather often said she had desert sand in her veins and sunshine in her spirit. At 25, she worked as a wilderness guide, leading tourists through the stunning landscapes of the Sonoran Desert. Her reputation for safety and adventure had made her one of the most requested guides in the region. That morning started like any other. Sarah checked her equipment twice, loaded fresh water into her saddlebags, and reviewed the weather forecast. The sky looked clear, with only scattered clouds on the horizon. Her client for the day was different from the usual tourists. Marcus Chin was a photographer from San Francisco, quiet and methodical, who wanted to capture the desert's raw beauty for a magazine feature. He had specifically requested a multi-day expedition to reach the remote areas where ancient petroglyphs decorated canyon walls. Sarah saddled Thunder, her trusted Palomino mare, and prepared Dusty, a gentle gelding for Marcus. The horses knew these trails better than most people knew their neighborhood streets. They had traveled these paths hundreds of times, navigating rocky terrain and sandy washes with the confidence that comes from experience. The first day went perfectly. Marcus proved to be an excellent rider and a fascinating companion. He shared stories about photographing wildlife in Alaska and mountain landscapes in Nepal. Sarah showed him hidden water sources where desert bighorn sheep came to drink, and ancient saguaro cacti that had stood for over 200 years. They camped that night under a blanket of stars so brilliant it seemed like the entire universe was putting on a show just for them. The second day brought them deeper into the wilderness, following a trail that wound through towering red rock formations. Sarah pointed out medicinal plants that her grandmother had taught her about, and Marcus captured images of desert wildflowers that bloomed after recent rains. The desert seemed alive with color and movement, from the quick flash of a roadrunner to the slow, graceful dance of a hawk riding thermal currents high above. It happened so suddenly that neither of them saw it coming. They were descending a steep section of trail when a diamondback rattlesnake, startled by Thunder's approach, struck without warning. The mare reared in panic, and Sarah, caught completely off guard, was thrown backward. Time seemed to slow as she fell, her body twisting through the air before crashing against a jagged boulder. The impact sent a shock of pain through her spine that was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Marcus dismounted quickly and rushed to her side. Sarah lay motionless for several terrifying seconds before her eyes fluttered open. She tried to sit up, but the movement sent waves of agony through her lower back and legs. Something was terribly wrong. She could barely feel her legs, and when she tried to move them, nothing happened. The closest hospital was over 60 miles away, and their satellite phone had been damaged when Thunder bolted, scattering their supplies across the rocky ground. Sarah's medical training kicked in as she assessed her condition. She instructed Marcus on how to check her responses and monitor her vital signs. The numbness in her legs confirmed her worst fears, but she kept her voice calm and professional, not wanting to panic him. Marcus proved his worth in those crucial hours. Following Sarah's instructions, he fashioned a makeshift stretcher from sleeping bags and tent poles. He retrieved their scattered supplies and managed to catch both horses, who had settled down after the initial scare. Most importantly, he stayed calm and focused, even though Sarah could see the fear in his eyes. As evening approached, they faced a difficult decision. Moving Sarah could worsen her injury, but staying put without communication meant no one would find them for days. The weather forecast had mentioned possible storms, and being caught in the open during a desert thunderstorm could be deadly. Sarah made the call to attempt reaching the nearest ranger station, about 15 miles away. It would be slow going, but it was their best chance. The journey became a test of endurance and determination. Marcus led both horses, while Sarah lay secured on the makeshift stretcher, fighting waves of pain with each step the horses took. She used every technique she knew to stay conscious and alert, focusing on the rhythm of the horse's hooves and the sound of Marcus's voice as he talked to keep her engaged. They had covered maybe 5 miles when the first lightning appeared on the horizon. The storm was moving fast, bringing with it the violent winds and flash flood dangers that made desert storms so treacherous. Sarah knew they needed shelter immediately, but the landscape around them offered little protection. That's when she remembered the small cave system her grandfather had shown her years ago, hidden in a cluster of rocks about a mile off the main trail. Directing Marcus through her pain, Sarah guided them toward the rocky outcropping where the caves lay hidden. The wind was already picking up, carrying the scent of rain and the electricity that comes before a major storm. Thunder, the horse, sensed the approaching danger and moved with increasing urgency, as if understanding that time was running out. They reached the rocks just as the first fat raindrops began to fall. Marcus quickly led the horses to a sheltered area between large boulders and then carefully moved Sarah into the largest cave opening. It was barely big enough for both of them, but it would protect them from the worst of what was coming. As Marcus arranged their supplies and made Sarah as comfortable as possible, she looked up at him and saw something that surprised her. This quiet photographer from the city had transformed into someone she barely recognized. His hands were steady as he checked her pulse. His voice remained calm as he reassured her, and his eyes showed the kind of determination that comes from deep inside a person when faced with a real crisis. In that moment, Sarah realized that sometimes the most ordinary people reveal themselves to be extraordinary when circumstances demand it. The storm arrived with a fury that shook the very ground beneath them. Lightning illuminated the cave in stark, brilliant flashes, followed by thunder that seemed to roll on forever. Rain began falling in sheets, so thick they could barely see beyond the cave entrance. Sarah had experienced many desert storms, but this one felt different, more powerful, and threatening than any she remembered. As the storm raged around them, Marcus sat beside her, occasionally checking her condition and making sure she stayed warm. He told her stories about his travels, keeping her mind occupied and alert. Sarah found herself really listening to him for the first time, hearing not just his words, but the passion behind them, the way his voice changed when he described a particularly beautiful sunset or a challenging climb. The pain in her back came in waves, sometimes manageable and sometimes overwhelming. During the worst moments, Marcus would hold her hand and remind her to breathe deeply, using techniques he had learned during his own adventures in remote places. His presence became an anchor that kept her from drifting into the darkness that seemed to want to pull her under. As the night wore on and the storm showed no signs of letting up, Sarah began to understand that this experience was changing both of them in ways they couldn't yet fully comprehend. The storm continued through the night with an intensity that seemed almost personal, as if the desert itself was testing their resolve. Water poured from the cave entrance in streams, and the wind howled through the rocks with a sound like voices from another world. Marcus had positioned himself near the opening, watching for signs that the wash below might flood, which would trap them on their rocky perch until the waters receded. Sarah drifted in, and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid and alert, other times lost in a haze of pain and exhaustion. During her clearer moments, she watched Marcus with growing admiration. He had torn strips from his own shirt to better secure her makeshift splints, and he checked on the horses every few hours despite the dangerous conditions outside. His camera equipment, worth thousands of dollars, sat forgotten in a corner, while he focused entirely on keeping her alive and comfortable. Around midnight, Sarah's condition worsened. She developed a fever, and her responses became slower and less focused. Marcus knew enough about spinal injuries to understand that swelling around the injury site could be causing additional complications. With their limited supplies, there was little he could do except monitor her closely and keep her as still as possible. He used their remaining water sparingly, dampening a cloth to cool her forehead and giving her small sips to prevent dehydration. The photographer found himself talking to fill the silence between thunderclaps, sharing memories and thoughts he had never spoken aloud to anyone. He told Sarah about his childhood fear of storms and how he had learned to find beauty in their power through his camera lens. He described the moment he decided to leave his corporate job to pursue photography full-time and the family arguments that followed. His voice became a lifeline for both of them, a thread connecting them to hope and normalcy while chaos raged outside. Sarah, even in her weakened state, began to see Marcus differently. She had initially judged him as just another city person seeking a brief adventure before returning to his comfortable life. Now she understood that beneath his quiet exterior was someone who possessed real courage and compassion. He had adapted to their crisis with a calmness that many experienced outdoorsmen would have envied. As dawn approached, the storm began to weaken, though rain continued to fall steadily. Marcus ventured outside to check their situation and discovered that the wash below had indeed flooded, creating a temporary river where normally only sand existed. The water was moving fast and carried debris from upstream, making any attempt to cross extremely dangerous. They were effectively stranded until the flood subsided, which could take anywhere from hours to days depending on how much rain had fallen in the mountains. When he returned to the cave, Marcus found Sarah more alert than she had been in hours. The fever seemed to have broken, and her eyes tracked his movements with their familiar sharpness. She asked about their situation, and he gave her an honest assessment without trying to minimize their difficulties. They had enough food for maybe 2 more days, water for 1 day if they were careful, and no way to signal for help until the flooding receded. Sarah surprised him by smiling weakly. She explained that her grandfather had taught her that the desert never gives you more than you can handle, but it also never makes things easy. The trick was learning to work with the desert's rhythm instead of fighting against it. They would wait out the flood, conserve their resources, and trust that rescue would come when the time was right. That afternoon, as the rain finally stopped and pale sunlight began filtering through the clouds, they heard a sound that made their hearts race. Helicopter rotors were cutting through the air somewhere in the distance. Marcus grabbed their emergency mirror and positioned himself at the cave entrance, angling it to catch the sunlight. He flashed the signal repeatedly, hoping against hope that someone would see the reflection. The helicopter passed overhead twice before the pilot spotted the glinting mirror. The aircraft circled their position several times before finding a place to land on higher ground about a 1/4 mile away. Marcus could see figures moving around the helicopter, and he knew their ordeal was finally nearing an end. The rescue team included 2 paramedics who rappelled down to the cave while the pilot maintained radio contact with the nearest hospital. Sarah was conscious and coherent as they assessed her condition, providing detailed information about her symptoms and the timeline of her injury. The professionals confirmed what she had suspected. She had sustained serious damage to her lower spine that would require immediate surgery and extensive rehabilitation. Loading Sarah onto the rescue helicopter required careful coordination and specialized equipment. Marcus insisted on accompanying her, and the rescue team, recognizing his role in keeping her alive through the night, agreed to make room. As the aircraft lifted off, Sarah caught her last glimpse of the desert landscape that had been both beautiful and treacherous, a place of wonder and danger that had tested them both in ways they never expected. During the flight to the hospital, Marcus held Sarah's hand while the paramedics monitored her vital signs and administered pain medication through an 4-line. She squeezed his fingers when waves of pain hit, and he squeezed back a simple communication that said more than words could express. The city photographer and the desert guide had forged a connection in that storm that went deeper than friendship, though neither was ready to name it yet. The trauma team was waiting when they arrived at the hospital. Sarah was rushed into surgery, while Marcus found himself in the familiar but surreal environment of a hospital waiting room. He called Sarah's family from the phone she had given him, explaining the situation to her parents and sister. Her mother cried, her father asked detailed questions about the accident, and her sister immediately began making travel arrangements to fly in from Colorado. Hours passed before the surgeon emerged with news. The operation had been successful in stabilizing Sarah's spine, but the extent of nerve damage wouldn't be clear for several days. There was a possibility she might regain some function in her legs, but it was also possible that the paralysis could be permanent. The next few weeks would be critical in determining her long-term prognosis. Marcus spent that first night in the hospital, sleeping fitfully in a chair beside Sarah's bed. The nurses had tried to convince him to go home and rest, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. When Sarah woke in the recovery room, groggy from anesthesia and pain medication, the first thing she saw was his face. Despite everything that had happened, despite the uncertainty about her future, she felt a profound sense of gratitude that this unlikely partnership had brought them both safely through their trial. Over the following days, as Sarah's family arrived and the immediate crisis passed, Marcus found himself reluctant to return to his normal life. He had come to Arizona to photograph landscapes, but he had discovered something far more meaningful in that desert cave. The storm had stripped away the superficial layers of who they thought they were, revealing the essential core of their characters. They had seen each other at their most vulnerable and had responded with courage and compassion. Sarah's recovery would be long and uncertain, but Marcus made a promise to himself and to her that echoed the title of their story. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever obstacles her injury would create, he would be there to help her find her way back to the things she loved. The desert had brought them together under the worst possible circumstances, but it had also shown them something precious and worth fighting for. 3 months later, Marcus had rearranged his entire life around Sarah's recovery schedule. He had sublet his apartment in San Francisco and moved to a small rental house near the rehabilitation center in Phoenix. His photography work continued, but now he focused on local assignments that kept him close to where Sarah needed him most. He documented her progress through his lens, capturing moments of frustration and breakthrough with the same artistic eye he had once reserved for landscapes. The rehabilitation process proved to be more challenging than either of them had anticipated. Sarah's initial optimism gradually gave way to periods of deep discouragement as she struggled with the reality of her condition. Some days brought small victories, a slight sensation in her left leg, the ability to shift her weight independently, or successful completion of a particularly difficult exercise routine. Other days brought setbacks that seemed to erase weeks of progress, leaving her exhausted and questioning whether she would ever feel whole again. Marcus learned to read Sarah's moods and adapt his support accordingly. On good days, he pushed her to work harder, celebrating each small achievement with the enthusiasm of someone witnessing a miracle. On difficult days, he simply sat with her, offering his presence without trying to fix anything or force positivity into a situation that sometimes called for honest grief. Dr. Rodriguez, Sarah's primary physician, had explained that spinal cord injuries were unpredictable. Some patients with seemingly severe damage made remarkable recoveries, while others with less obvious trauma remained permanently affected. Sarah's case fell somewhere in the middle, with partial sensation returning to her legs, but significant weakness and coordination problems that made walking a major challenge. The physical therapy sessions became the focal point of Sarah's days. She worked with specialized equipment designed to retrain her nervous system and rebuild muscle strength. Marcus often stayed during these sessions, learning the exercises so he could help her practice at home. He bought medical textbooks and studied spinal cord anatomy with the same dedication he had once applied to understanding camera mechanics and lighting techniques. Sarah's family visited regularly, but Marcus noticed that their well-meaning encouragement sometimes added pressure rather than relief. They wanted to see dramatic improvement on every visit, and when progress was slow or imperceptible, their disappointment was hard to hide. Marcus, by contrast, had learned to find meaning in the smallest developments, understanding that recovery was measured in increments that might be invisible to casual observers. 6 months after the accident, Sarah experienced her first major breakthrough. During a routine therapy session, she managed to stand independently for nearly 30 seconds without support. The achievement might have seemed modest to an outside observer, but for Sarah, it represented a fundamental shift in what seemed possible. Marcus was there when it happened, and the photograph he took of her standing, arms outstretched and face glowing with determination, became one of the most powerful images in his entire portfolio. The breakthrough opened new possibilities in Sarah's treatment plan. Her medical team introduced more advanced exercises and began discussing the potential for adaptive equipment that might allow her to return to some form of outdoor activity. Sarah had been afraid to hope for too much, but the conversation about her future began to include words like horseback riding again, even if it might require specialized saddles and support systems. Marcus researched therapeutic riding programs with the same thoroughness he brought to everything else. He discovered centers that specialized in helping people with spinal cord injuries reconnect with horses, using specially trained animals and modified equipment to make riding safe and accessible. He visited these facilities, interviewed instructors, and even volunteered at one center to better understand the techniques they used. The day finally came when Sarah's doctor cleared her to attempt therapeutic riding. Marcus had arranged everything carefully, working with a program that specialized in adaptive riding for people with mobility challenges. The facility was located on a ranch outside Tucson, surrounded by the same desert landscape where their journey had begun, but now filled with hope instead of danger. Sarah approached the experience with a mixture of excitement and terror. She had dreamed about riding again during the darkest days of her recovery, but she had also developed fears about horses that she had never experienced before. The accident had changed her relationship with risk, making her acutely aware of how quickly everything could change. Marcus understood her anxiety and stayed close, offering reassurance without being overbearing. The therapeutic riding instructor, a woman named Elena who had been working with adaptive riding for 15 years, introduced Sarah to Gentle Ben, a massive but incredibly calm draft horse who specialized in working with riders who had balance and mobility challenges. The horse stood perfectly still while Sarah was helped into a specially designed saddle that provided extra support and security. The moment Sarah settled into the saddle, something shifted in her expression. Despite the modifications and safety equipment, despite the weakness in her legs and the fear in her heart, she was riding again. The horse moved at an almost ceremonial pace, but Sarah was experiencing the rhythm and freedom that had been such an important part of her identity before the accident. Marcus watched from the fence line, his camera capturing every moment, but his attention focused entirely on Sarah's face. He could see the joy and relief washing over her as muscle memory kicked in and her body remembered how to move with the horse's gait. It wasn't the same as her riding before the accident, but it was undeniably real and meaningful. After the session, Sarah sat in her wheelchair beside the horse, tears streaming down her face. She looked up at Marcus and smiled with more genuine happiness than he had seen since before their desert ordeal. In that moment, both of them understood that the promise he had made during the storm had been fulfilled, not in the way they had originally imagined, but in a way that was perhaps even more meaningful. The therapeutic riding sessions became a regular part of Sarah's routine, and gradually she progressed to longer rides and more challenging activities. She learned to mount and dismount with minimal assistance, to control the horse with modified reins that compensated for limited leg function, and to navigate simple trail courses that reminded her of the desert guides she used to lead. Marcus documented this journey as well, creating a photographic essay about recovery, adaptation, and the power of determination. The project grew into something larger when a magazine expressed interest in the story, not just as a medical piece about spinal cord injury, but as a human interest story about love, resilience, and the unexpected ways that tragedy can transform into something beautiful. A year after the accident, Sarah returned to work part-time, developing educational programs about desert safety and adaptive outdoor recreation. She couldn't lead the same kinds of expeditions she had before, but her experience gave her unique insights into helping people with disabilities experience the natural world safely. Marcus became her business partner, handling the photography and documentation while Sarah focused on instruction and program development. Their relationship had evolved gradually from the intense bond formed during crisis into something deeper and more sustainable. They had seen each other at their worst and their best, and they had learned to build something together that honored both their individual strengths and their shared experiences. The desert had tested them in ways they never expected, but it had also given them gifts they couldn't have imagined. On a warm evening, 18 months after the accident, they returned to a section of desert near where their original adventure had begun. Sarah sat confidently in her adaptive saddle while Marcus photographed the sunset, painting the landscape in brilliant oranges and purples. The horses moved slowly and peacefully through the familiar terrain, and Sarah felt a deep sense of completion. She looked over at Marcus, this quiet man who had become so central to her life, and realized that sometimes the most important promises are the ones that require us to redefine what we thought was possible. She was sitting in a saddle again, just as he had promised during that terrible storm, but the victory was different and perhaps more meaningful than either of them had originally envisioned. The desert stretched endlessly around them, beautiful and challenging as always, but now it felt like an ally rather than an adversary. They had learned to work with its rhythms, to respect its power, and to find beauty in adaptation rather than resistance. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sarah and Marcus rode slowly home, their horses moving in perfect harmony across the sand that had once threatened to defeat them, but had instead taught them how to be strong.